All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building, and I have a really big crowd today, which is great. Today I'm strangely enough broadcasting from Florida, where I am staying with my friend Janice, and Janice is awesome. And yay, thank you for hosting me, Janice. But anyway, I have two kittens behind me who may or may not come catapulting across the screen during the course of the hangout. Just so you know. Today's topic is culture and how it is reinforced and changed. And I figured this would be, it's going to sound really esoteric, I think, just as a title, but honestly, I want to talk about how we teach our own values to people around us and to our kids, and how what we do changes the way that culture works, and how that kind of change happens over time. It's actually quite simple. It's similar in some ways to language change, but you know, because the two are intertwined, obviously. But I think it's something that's worth mentioning, and I also think that it's something that we're often seeing happen in fiction. Maybe not the subtle ways that it happens, but you know, whenever we see wars or you know, grand conflicts over power, these are things that can have really profound effects on culture. And I think we spend a lot of time thinking about those massive effects, and less time thinking about small ways in which culture changes over time or is reinforced by people who are enacting it. But anyway, so I thought we could kind of see how we go with this. I'm not talking so much about art and maybe high culture, even though high culture is part of culture, but more like things like daily practices, manners and values and things like that. One of the things that I learned when I was studying pragmatics and manners in college was that we are very, very active in our teaching of manners, both to our own kids and to people around us. We actively enforce what we perceive as appropriate manners or good manners, or you know, we enforce boundaries that are defined by our culture. And we see that a lot, and it's also something that comes up a lot in fictional contexts, where you see, you know, the downtrodden people. Well, you know, why are they downtrodden? Who decided to trod on them? All that kind of thing, right? These systems are actively taught, and I think it's worthwhile to look at how that's done. If you've ever seen parents out in the supermarket with kids, you will often see active teaching of manners going on in that kind of context. You can also see it if you are ever visiting elementary school or preschool. But you know, you will very often hear people, well, that's not how we do it. And it's not necessarily even always defined very clearly. It's, you know, there are certain kinds of messages like, oh, well, you know, that is not what boys do, or that is not what girls do, or that is not what good children do. Or, you know, sometimes the group membership that is at stake is actually really clear, and sometimes it's just sort of a nebulous we. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure we've all seen it.
The other thing that's not clear, if you what you're saying is that's not how we do it, or that's not what we do, rather than something explicit like, please say thank you. Don't say specific rude thing. Then it can be unclear what it is you're being reinforced, and it can be unclear to the person who's on the receiving end of the reinforcement or the instruction.
That's about the meta message of what we say explicitly and what we don't say explicitly.
Sure, go on.
Where we say, oh, that's not how we do it, and that is itself cultural, and it's about a culture of explicit statements versus a culture of implicit remarks, where who is in charge of shaping and sorting the information, and where is that responsibility shared, and that's a cultural thing. And as you were saying, it's also a reinforcement of who is empowered there.
Yeah.
Vagueness, who is empowered by vagueness or protected by vagueness varies from culture to culture.
Yeah.
Depending upon whether the culture values vagueness or not.
Right.
And whether the culture values bluntness or not. So there's a certain kind of jockeying that happens in some cultures where forcing the other person to say something explicitly is a loss on the other person's part.
Oh, that is a good point.
Everybody's supposed to not say the thing.
Yeah.
And so if you prove that you cannot handle the veiled conversation and the meta conversation, you might lose social prestige in that kind of culture. And then there are other cultures where saying things bluntly is very esteemed, but also reserved to the people with power.
Yeah.
And we see this in gendered ways in a lot of cultures, where sometimes the ruler will be able to just say, oh, make it happen. And they don't have to say what or anything else. But in other ways, you will see that being able to say a thing bluntly is a thing only for empowered people. Yeah. And everybody else has to say it vaguely.
Yeah.
And so then that segues into the thing that I've been talking about a lot. I have a new hashtag, etiquette for social justice.
Okay.
Because what we consider rude and impolite seems like it's just rules for everybody. But when you examine them more closely, it's about who gets to say something is okay or not okay, who has to hold their tongue, who gets to have their say because, oh, well, that's just grandma. Oh, so-and-so's old. Oh, so-and-so's young. Oh, so-and-so is, smarter than you. Oh, so-and-so needs more accommodation. And all of that is presented in that moment as if it were universal truths.
Yeah.
But really, most of those are masks for that person has more social power than you. You need to shut up.
Yeah.
And that is one way to prevent changes or slow down changes in culture, is to let people with hanging on to the previous state, let them do that in the face of attempts to move on.
And I think one of the things that gets taught is people who are licensed to instruct are not always the people in power. And so you can also teach somebody that you are not the person in power. So and what I'm trying to say is that just because you are instructing someone in how the culture works does not mean that you have power in that culture.
Yes. I've been watching a lot of shows about Edwardian and Victorian England and other things like that, and that's entirely highlighted in the role of governesses and tutors. They are charged with, in certain sections of society, they're charged with teaching the young scions how to behave, but they themselves are not actually in any authority except for temporarily as proxy to the parents, but they don't have the same amount of power. And there's that jockeying that traditionally happens between their charges and the people who are supposed to be in supervisory positions toward them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see that a lot in social media where, you know, the dominant culture will say, well, then teach me. And it's not actually a request. It's, I am now going to argue against your personhood and you're going to suck it up and take it. And there's that dichotomy of, I demand to be respected, but I will not respect you. And then that's considered a level playing field. I think a lot of the things that we see there are really interesting. I do a lot of my own self-care there, but I've noticed that, you know, when people come into my space and act up,
Mm-hmm.
they will usually get slapped down by 10 of my friends before I even get there. And so setting norms and setting up the way that I do things really transfers through to how everyone else expects the third party to behave in my space. Because I've already said, this is what we do and this is how we do it. And I didn't do it on purpose. It just happened that way.
So,
well, I think in fact, social media is very interesting because you do end up having a subculture on a particular person's page.
Okay.
One of the other interesting ends is the flip side of the instruction versus social hierarchy that we just brought up is that the opposite also pertains, where somebody may not have any authority but has protection, or ways in which somebody may be have a public persona of being very fragile and everything else, and yet be wielding a enormous amount of power by proxy. And there's also the issue when we're talking about looking at hierarchy of what is considered violence, what is considered too much, what is considered unacceptable. For instance, at what point do you decide that the conversation has become uncivil? At what point do you decide that things that were really atrocious were said? And it's very interesting across cultures to see what is taboo and what's not taboo.
Mm-hmm.
And to look at what you're allowed to talk about and what you're allowed to assert.
Mm-hmm.
Because some assertions are, if you look at them with the frame of social justice, they are very violent in that they're promoting certain kinds of oppression and suppression, but they're considered quite ordinary statements if you're not looking in that frame. So those are some of the other ways that culture is spread. It's spread in the ways that we tell our stories and what's considered ordinary. We don't have to explain that in the old fairy tales. Nobody has to explain that the princess will go adventuring and the princesses will be rescued.
Right.
That's all there in the assumptions, and we don't have to teach explicitly that girls are passive and boys are active, because it's just part of the way we tell the story.
Right.
In individual cases, and this is how one of the ways that things change, if individual cases, there are enough different cases. My godkids and my kid did not know for the first 5, 6, 7 years of their lives that girls cook and boys eat. They did not know that, because in their experience at home, that was not true.
I met a little girl who was convinced that daddy's cook and mommy's work because that's what she had experienced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was her home culture.
Yeah. But it wasn't culture, the culture that we grew up in, that is the moms and dads who dads who cooked and moms who don't. The culture that we grew up in, the times, it was changing, but the assumption was still girls cook, boys eat. And I'm using those words specifically because of a book that was that my mother saw, that basically said that and a whole bunch of other girls or servants and boys are in charge, pieces of garbage.
There's
But but we changed that. You know, the moms and the dads changed that, and so now there's a difference between the culture that we grew up in and the culture that our kids grew up in, and it's because we acted differently in the culture that we grew up in.
Yeah, I mean, so how much influence does a single family's action have on a larger cultural frame?
I'm also going to note that there is a certain culture there was a cultural trope and norm that was just expressed right now that assumes that things progress and then stay that way, as opposed to things constantly flexing back and forth about, oh, this is what we grew up with, but now it's changed. As opposed to,
so our perception of cultural change is often termed progress. Is that what you're saying?
There are cultures that assume that change is linear, and there are cultures that assume that change is cyclical, or there are cultures that assume that anything that looks like a change is an aberration, and things will return to their center. And there are cultures that assume that things are progressing from order to chaos, and cultures that assume that things are proceeding from chaos to order. And those are all really deep cultural assumptions. And right now we're about to, in the West, see a story come out. What is it? The book of something for boys? Something about adventures for boys or something? I don't remember what it's called.
It was the dangerous book for boys.
Yes, it's based on the idea that boys do dangerous things, and there's a girls' version, but the girls' version is much, much tamer, and the things it's suggesting for girls to do are still much more domestic than the things they're suggesting for boys to do.
Yeah.
And so as much progress as many of us feel we're seeing around us, there's also measures to try to push that back. And the media we consume tends to reinforce these lines, even as we don't notice it because it's not said overtly, it's just modeled.
Yeah.
Right. So what you have, I mean, I think just to keep the focus on the way that things change. So there are a lot of potential sources of change. And I think one of the things that I think is worth noting is that both language and culture are changed by people enacting them and speaking them and doing them, right? So the use of language, the enactment of culture, are what reinforces culture, but also what changes culture, right? So those are sort of the mechanisms. Excuse me for a second. Don't do that. Cat attacking my electrical cord. That was really not good.
Never do that.
So stasis and change both come from this ongoing reenactment that we're always doing. So what you can find is that you can suddenly have a piece of art. Let's just say the movie Black Panther, for example, which bursts out into public consciousness and then has the ability to become part of the canon in its own way. And it can become an instance in the sort of an anchor in the cultural narrative that pulls the culture in a particular direction. At the same time, everybody is simultaneously making other kinds of artistic statements, making other kinds of personal statements. But I think it's worth noting that this stuff the changes that happen grow out of this process of making art and making statements.
I think when we say that, we also need to look at the fact that when we say a culture, we need to define the boundaries very clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say things as if there was a unitary culture, what that really means is either the most numerous or the most privileged or the most, well, least suppressed and least marginalized culture.
Mm.
And that there are always subcultures happening at the same time. And
Yeah,
one of the things that makes world building look artificial and unreal in genre stories is when you don't have subcultures,
mm-hmm.
and you assume a unitary, universal culture and don't examine who is disprivileged or privileged within that culture. Or if there isn't an obvious sect or group of disempowered people, how is that maintained? How is that egalitarian, utopian construct managed? These are also important parts of thinking about how the culture is defined and how it's spread. Because how you correct people who fall out of that is really important, or how you encourage people to adhere to that.
There are a lot of different pressures that will change a culture. Different aspects of a culture. Art, for example, technology is a thing that will change cultures, I think, because it makes the reinforcement of various aspects either harder or easier.
And some technologies actually just never catch on and then vanish. You know.
Yeah. Availability of things for art, availability of materials to paint with or sculpt with,
and distribution of those materials.
If food is an essential part of your culture, that was a rhetorical thing. Then availability of ingredients is going to be something that may change the expression of a culture.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to say something before we go much further. Sorry, Kate, can you give me just a second?
Go ahead. Yep.
I want to make sure that it's clear that when I'm talking about culture, I am not talking about a unitary thing. I'm thinking about the chaos theory model of culture and language, which basically says that culture and language are basically these sort of seething, chaotic creatures that have all kinds of sub-patterns of order. It's worth going and looking into. It's, so we can say, it's a bit like weather, we have overall large-scale weather patterns that we can say that we understand, and then within that we have some smaller things that we can describe a form of order within that. But on some level, a lot of it is unpredictable.
Well,
and so I find that model useful because it just basically keeps us from sitting down and assuming that culture is somehow a unitary thing. It's always got layers and certain kinds of things that influence in one direction, some other things that influence it in other directions, and lots and lots of subcultures.
Yeah, and I think that's actually one of the things that makes world building unbelievable is assuming that. Sherry Tepper in The Gate to Women's Country basically says explicitly, well, we don't have gay people because we genetically bred them out. And it's like, oh, that's not how genetics works. And it's also not how cultures, okay. And so you just have to decide whether you're going to take that for the purpose of the story and go with it, or whether that's just going to annoy your hindbrain the entire rest of the story.
Wrote the book. Yeah. So does that include things like you're saying, like weather patterns, conflicting subcultures being like clashing storm fronts?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a messy metaphor, but let's just say that you can kind of see attractors and multiple levels of structure and different kinds of patterns emerging at different levels of structure, and sort of inter-influence. There are a lot of different kinds of ow, geez, cat. There are a lot of different kinds of there are a lot of concepts there that I find metaphorically useful.
Is there a specific book that you were mentioning?
Gosh.
Oh, that's too cute.
I would have to sorry, he's just kind of been freaking out a little bit. I'm going to try to calm him down. I do not have a book. I can actually, I have books that I'm thinking of, but I don't want to point you at the wrong one.
Okay.
It's been a while.
Put it in the notes.
So I'll see if I can find books for you.
Thank you.
So I find it really interesting as we're talking and you have a cat crawling around on you.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about the ways in which, because I've been looking at culture and I've been looking at culture shifts, whether or not people live with animals is a big cultural thing. And one of the interesting places where that's enforced is in the language. There are languages where house literally means things like place where humans reside.
Oh, yeah.
As opposed to, in English, we do have specialized words like kennel and barn, but house for us does not mean only humans.
Yeah.
And
That's
the
true.
ways in which language, as we get back to culture, we're in the middle of a giant culture shift in English right now, and many other languages as well, where we're arguing out in the same way that people were arguing out whether or not he was a universal thing in general. Now we are arguing out whether pronouns need to be assigned by fiat, by other people's observation of you, or whether pronouns are indeed personal and selected and enforced by the person being referred to. And so we're very deliberately hacking that culture right now.
Yeah.
Which is how we end up with books that are also exploring that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not certainly something that just happened this year, but it's very, I think, present in a lot of people's minds as a very, very clear way we're hacking the culture. And I don't know how clear the parallel between that and mixed heritage relationships is to people, because one of the things people are resorting to with pronouns is to say, well, that's not grammatical, or that's not what's in the dictionary. And the equivalent to that for mixed heritage relationships was to say that's illegal. And not only was it illegal to marry people, there was also the Hays Code that was also reinforcing it from the media end, because you could not depict mixed heritage relationships in any positive way.
Yeah.
It was actually part of the code. We only talk about whether or not you could show married couples in bed together. But it was also, can you have POC and white mixed relationships on the screen? And it was codified into the law and the code and also into artistic custom. And there was also, along with that, whether or not you were allowed to show happy queer relationships.
Yep.
And so these are all ways that we end up reinforcing whether or not things are acceptable in the culture, or how people who push those boundaries are seen.
Yeah. Yep, that's a good point.
Yeah, and a lot of the history of science fiction mostly has a lot of examples, almost all of them, of the assumption here is that white people and white men are the only people who are going out and doing the spacefaring thingy. And as we get further into contemporary, now we have all of a sudden other groups of people showing up and doing the thing. And there's a huge amount of tension around who gets to be the protagonist and whose cultures are acceptable to be sent out into the wider world. And
Yeah.
I think the books and the TV show The Expanse is probably the best version of this is what the future is going to look like, and the future is not the inheritance of one group of people.
Yeah.
It's these days the way to dismiss that we talk about it is we talk about it as being political. It's really interesting that somehow saying something is political is a way of stopping cultural change.
Yeah.
That's a very specific sort of effective stopper.
And yet we've had the personal is political for 40 plus years, and it still works to shut people down.
Yeah.
Which is another way that we reinforce our dominant culture's values, and don't necessarily support those that aren't that.
Okay, so let's shift gears just a little bit. I think we've talked about a lot of really interesting stuff, but I want to sort of see if we can talk about depiction of change in fiction. I mean, we've talked about representation in fiction. Are there places that you think there are really interesting and valuable depictions of cultural change going on? Or are there ways that you are trying to express cultural change in your work? I mean, thoughts on that?
I'm still stuck on wanting to talk about the difference between calling something rude and calling something taboo. Because what we've done in the white-dominated West is we've created this word taboo, which is only used for those cultures over there of those people with their irrational boundaries. And then we have our culture, which has, politeness and civility and ethics and all these other words we use to draw a line about why what we say is okay is actually good and proper and reasonable and all the things we esteem. But all the things they say are good are just what's wrong with those people.
Well, and also taboo is a loan word from Tongan.
Right. So, I mean, well, but we specifically have used the loan word there because it others the words of other cultures.
Right, and I don't think that taboo is used 100% exclusively for othering purposes, but the people who use it to describe our own culture are not really part of the mainstream discourse. So, I mean, I think it's a fair observation, even though, academically, I think it's used more broadly. Or at least I've seen it used in a more broad sense.
If you use taboo about things within mainstream culture, you are very definitely being transgressive and trying to decenter and decolonize and to remove the artificial line between those cultures which have taboos and this one. So, I mean, any sociological term is not like saying oxygen. Oxygen has a very specific meaning that you can pinpoint.
Yeah.
Taboo has a meaning that is dependent on implications. But I kind of want to talk about that because I think that the books that are interesting are the ones that actually are very conscious of what's happening there. So I'm sure there's new stuff that has been written that I am woefully behind on. But again, I keep coming back to Bujold because she's specifically talking about what happens when you isolate a culture and then suddenly bring it back out.
Yep. Another really good example of something like that is the Coyote series by Alan M. Steele. It's, humans going off and colonizing another planet, but it's because the culture on Earth has become such that they can't live in it. And what happens at some point is that the aliens sort of show up and they give them a book that's sort of like the Bible to the aliens, but it's not, there's no deity involved. And slowly, as those ideas filter through this colonizing culture, that culture itself changes significantly. It's actually really cool to watch. But a lot of it is very sort of proto-Buddhist, but just it really alters the way they live in big, huge ways as you go further through the series.
Yeah. So I was actually looking for ways to portray one of my characters as having power when she is a person that a lot of people would quite easily fall into thinking she has no power. And one of the ways that I try to show that she has power is by showing her influence on culture. And it has something, it's partly to do with the fact that she is a person who has a lot of privilege, right? So she's in a position to be able to have the resources to, say, make a fashion statement, right? But events also conspire to make her statements resonate on a larger level. So.
Yeah, and I, in the story that I wrote that is yet unpublished, I will whine about that later. I took the sort of dominant culture fantasy of why don't we kill off everybody who isn't us? And went, okay, but if you think about it, the people who have been doing this for 400 years are a really small percentage of the wider world culture. So what happens if we kill all of them? And then I haven't really thought about how that would change culture, and now I have 6 more books to write. Okay.
I want to go back to the idea that affecting culture is a measure of power. The ability to affect culture amongst the powerful set is an indication of power, but in the West for the last 150 years, culture has been constantly appropriated and changed from the most disempowered margins.
Yeah.
Our culture is driven by the transgressions and adaptations of our most marginalized. They're not coming from the people with the most power. And there's an interesting, if you go back before colonization, there's an interesting tension between the art creators and the art supporters and the art suppressors. Wow, I don't think that's normally pronounced suppressor in English, in American English. Anyway, but there's a tension going on there, and the people who have the most power in that equation are the people who are suppressing the cultural change, and not the people who are pushing for it or who are paying for it. So, you've got church art happening. Well, the people who have the power in that system are the people who are destroying the art and saying art is bad. have the most sort of violent and political power. People with a lot of mimetic power are the people who are saying, but wait, let's look at these other things. And possibly bards and storytellers. But bards and storytellers don't often have temporal power. They have cultural power.
Mm-hmm.
So I think demarcating those is important.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why I'm interested in showing my character having a power to influence art and fashion and things like that is because she's not allowed to have other kinds of power that might be able to give her control over her own destiny, for example, or control over, events that are occurring in the government and that kind of stuff.
So let's talk about that. Means that the culture she is in
Mm-hmm.
does not regulate those expressions from a place of political and coercive power. Because if you were in a culture of sumptuary laws, for instance,
Sure.
then that avenue of expression is closed off for you. So what it's talking about is that character having power within the niche that character is in and allowed to have the power.
Mm-hmm.
But that
Absolutely.
doesn't. So that's a comparative power as opposed to an absolute power.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm looking and thinking about, the story about one of the Georges that's really talks about how much one of the kings, George, how much power he had, is that the name of the river changes because of his pronunciation. It stops being the Thames, it becomes the Thames because he can't say Thames. Right? This is about the cultural power of that king.
Where did you read that?
It's a commonly told story about one of the Hanoverian kings of England. He was of German ancestry, and so his English was very accented.
Okay.
But because they're in London and that's where the river is, that river comes up in conversation. You can't embarrass the king by pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah.
So his pronunciation becomes the official pronunciation. And that
was King George the First.
Right.
Sorry, Kate, was it the third or the first?
First.
First.
Huh.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, so that is definitely interesting. I will point out though that the often repeated story about Castilian Spanish and lisps and things is in fact apocryphal and not a thing. So I think it's fully possible for both of those things to be distinct from one another.
I think often this is described as the difference between hard and soft power versus like explicit versus implicit.
And I think actually that's something that is underexplored in fiction. Because we often like to talk about hard power stuff. And especially when you're dealing with people who are oppressed and depicting their lives, it's easy to assume, it's too easy to assume, oh, well, this person doesn't have any power. That can't be the case. I mean, you exert the power that you can over the things that you can in order to live your life. So what those restrictions are and how they allow you to interact and how they allow you to create influence, I think are really, really interesting questions to explore.
Yeah, because I mean, the way that it usually ends in science fiction is that, yes, you have this group of people who are oppressed until they come riding giant sandworms out of the desert and beat up your society.
Right.
So, the counterpoint to that, again, because I really like reading Bujold for culture, is that Bujold explicitly has one of her characters saying, wow, you people only think that power is about ruling things and you've described me as a disempowered, ineffectual person, but you've just handed me all of your social, cultural power because you have entrusted the education of your next ruler onto me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this is an outsider who comes in and completely subverts the society by taking a culture that has a very, very strong, the ruler at the head can dictate all sorts of things,
Mm-hmm.
and has put that ruler under the tutelage of an outsider who is then inoculating them with all sorts of outsider ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one of the things that we talk about when people do very gendered studies of fiction, because of the ways that women have traditionally been marginalized. A lot of the stories are about the exploration of how does a marginalized person exert autonomy and also influence.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the stories of people who are already in positions of autonomy and influence don't usually explore how do you do that. They kind of go into what do you do with that, with autonomy and power, as opposed to how do you attain it and how is it preserved.
Right.
So I think that's it is in fact, I think, why it's important to look at representation in books and who's writing them and how they're written.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the things that makes it's what I like to read about. And so I know that a lot of the books being written by people of color are also exploring that by default, because the viewpoint is not the predominant viewpoint. And so when we're writing our characters as people doing creative works, it's really interesting to look at where is that character in relation to the society, the predominant society in that character's world.
Mm-hmm.
There's always the temptation to write about the princes because, he gets to go out and do the things. But personally, I think the interesting story is I want to know the story of the prince's groom.
The prince's what?
The prince's groom, right?
Oh,
the
groom.
one who's
Yeah, sure.
taking care of his horse.
I'm like, groom? That's a little strange.
No, the groom.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't take care of the prince's horse, well, maybe the prince can punish you, but you can really give the prince a bad day.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
There are these little things that are happening. So this is how culture works, right? By getting everybody to participate in keeping it on track, or from people managing to sway it, and then those things actually taking hold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are a lot of untold underbelly stories and behind the scenes stories, and all kinds of things that needs to happen.
More stories about people who are teachers and tutors and governesses, and who have power and influence without authority, without respect, because governesses and tutors and teachers and people who teach and pass on culture and skill are not respected in so many dominant.
I also think that I really like seeing children in stories, and not even as main characters, but just having children appear in stories in ways that show where kids, what place children have, and how they are expected to learn the ways of the culture around them and from whom. That stuff always fascinates me.
And then you have rare instances of kids who can't learn a culture, or who have a difficulty learning their own culture, for any number of developmental reasons, any number of you know, their nanny or their governess or their tutor, and so they're not getting fully integrated into their own culture that way. I find a lot of the stories that involve kids tend to have that piece somehow, right? That they haven't quite connected with their culture for one reason or another.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of stories about not fitting in, but I think the question of not fitting in is a little bit more complicated than whether you are fitting into your culture. Because I think there are some licensed and non-licensed ways to not fit in, for example. It's an interesting question.
And there's also people are, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that narratively, it's easier to write an outsider because it allows them to critique or to marvel or to otherwise look at the culture from the outside. It's much harder to write the characters from deeply entrenched and within the culture.
Yes.
Because the things they gloss over are the parts that are actually important to the reader.
Yeah.
I think there's a certain amount of tropiness with that there's a certain arc to that story that we expect to have. And I know I've talked about this before on this show, but Shoes to Run by Sarah Gengi, or Gengi, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Genge.
Okay.
The character is someone who does not fit into her culture, or is presented that way at the very beginning. She's going out with the men to go hunting. And she is trying to erase all of the bodily aspects that are making her female because she's about 12. And she is not happy with not being a boy. And she goes out hunting with the men anyway and ends up, you know, showing the way to the quarry, and I think she actually kills it. And she collapses at the end because this is persistence hunting. And rather than having the overall culture say, okay, you did this great thing, but you're still a girl, the very end part of it, and I'm going to ruin it for everybody right now, is that one of the other hunters walks over and picks him up. And so they've actually managed to do the thing they wanted to do, which I think is not really shown a whole bunch.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, that's a whole other topic, like how gender is defined and that kind of thing.
Well, it also says that culture is open enough to say, if you do the thing that we need you to do, we will let you be who you need to be. Which I thought was sort of hopeful.
What's interesting there is, which way do you go when you're accepting that cultural change, right?
Yeah.
You expand the definition of male hunter and how male hunters do things, or do you expand the definition of who can hunt?
Right.
So, yes. Yeah.
The fact that it doesn't get suppressed is one element that's really interesting, and then how it gets absorbed is another thing.
Yeah.
And
I hate to say this, but we're over time.
Where did it go again?
Well, you know, this one I knew it was gonna be a bit of a slow start, but that we were just gonna be thundering towards the end of the hour. You guys are all awesome. What can I say? So next week, I currently have no concept of next week.
I really have no concept of tomorrow.
Florida, you know, it's disorienting. What can I say?
Why don't we talk about concepts of time?
Concepts of time. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
I like that. Let's do that.
Let's do that. Okay. Concepts of time. It's official.
The one I was going to propose was the expectations of age.
Ooh, that's next.
Okay, I'm writing it down too.
Because, you know, I keep getting told, you get more conservative as you get older.
Yeah.
Very interesting, specific cultural assumption.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Great. So I have those both on the list for upcoming hangouts, and I'm just gonna say this every time until Worldcon. I'm having a party for the show at Worldcon, so everybody come. If you have access to the to ways of making food, bring food inspired by fiction to my party. We're gonna have it's the name of the party is Eat Your World, Read Your Food. and so there will be people bringing food inspired by fiction. There will also be authors reading snippets about food from their fiction.
Cool.
And hopefully it will be a lot of fun. It's on August 19th at 4 p.m.
Okay.
And I'm going to put up flyers because we cannot figure out what room it's going to be in until the con starts.
Sure. I think I'm still scheduled to be on a panel about food in fiction.
Okay.
But the Worldcon schedule is entirely in flux, so
yeah.
Who knows? But that might be fun for you to come to, and hopefully they don't clash.
I will keep an eye out.
Ironic if
I'll
they're
write
at
a
the
note.
same time. And I don't know if I'm bringing food because I'm in the middle of moving.
Woo!
Oh yeah.
So.
Sounds excellent. Well, anyway, thank you all for being here, and thank you for making my show as interesting as it is. I couldn't do it without you, and I will stop the broadcast.